They gave my bed to their dog. Not figuratively, not as a joke, not by accident. I walked into my own bedroom, my sanctuary for almost 4 decades, and found a golden retriever sprawled across my mattress, snoring softly, while my pillow lay on the floor like a piece of trash. And my son, standing there with arms folded, as if this were the most natural arrangement in the world, said, "Mom, Daisy needs a softer place to sleep. She's getting old." Old. At 78, I suppose I should have appreciated the solidarity. But even a tired old woman can feel the sting of disrespect sharper than a knife. I stood very still, my hand on the doorframe, pretending my balance faltered so they wouldn't see what truly shook in me. My bed, my room, my husband's dresser, the same one we bought when we were both still young enough to argue about the color of wood. And now his things were pushed aside to make room for a dog bed they didn't even bother to unpack before tossing onto the floor, my floor, where Daisy had apparently decided it was beneath her. Sharon didn't even look up from her phone. "We moved your things into the laundry room, Eleanor. It's closer to the bathroom anyway." Safer for you. Safer. How quickly that word becomes a leash around an old woman's throat. I didn't answer. Words don't come easily when the people you once held as babies now speak to you as if you were a misplaced piece of furniture. I simply nodded, because nodding was the only thing left they hadn't taken from me. I walked down the hallway, my hallway, though it hadn't felt like mine in a long while, and opened the door to the laundry room. They'd placed a narrow folding cot against the washing machine. No blanket, no pillow. An unspoken message in crisp daylight. The smell of detergent and damp towels hit me first. The humiliation came second, slow and heavy, like settling dust. For months, I'd been telling myself that letting Michael's family stay was temporary. A kindness. A chance for them to save money after they fell behind. I let them move into the spare room, then the office, then the den. Each step, a small surrender, a compromise, a mother's soft place, the one children walk over because they can. But this was the first time I understood they hadn't simply moved into my house. They had moved me out of it. Somewhere between their laughter downstairs and the dog's sigh from my bedroom, a strange calm settled over me. Not the quiet of defeat. No, it was the quiet of a locked door finally opening inside my chest. I looked at the cot again, then at the closed door behind me, and for the first time in years, I felt something stronger than pain. I felt clarity. I would not sleep here. Not tonight. Not ever again. I reached for the light switch, turned it off, and stood in the dark for a long, steady breath. The kind you take before making a choice you know will change everything. They thought they'd reduced me to a corner. But corners have edges, and edges cut. This house still had my name on every legal paper, and before the week was over, they would learn exactly what that meant. If you enjoy the stories here, dear, you're welcome to join our Patreon. There you'll find exclusive tales that never appear on YouTube, and new stories come out earlier than anywhere else. The link is just below. We're waiting for you. People think disrespect arrives like a storm, loud, sudden, impossible to miss. But in truth, it seeps in like dampness under a door, slowly, silently, until the floorboards swell and crack, and you realize the house has been rotting for years. When Michael first asked if they could stay for a month or two, he stood in my doorway with that polite smile he must have practiced in the mirror. Sharon hovered behind him, pretending to admire my rose bushes while tapping impatiently on her phone. They'd had a setback, he said. A a temporary struggle. Just a little help, Mom. I didn't ask for details. Mothers rarely do. They moved into the guest room first. I washed the sheets, placed flowers on the nightstand, set out fresh towels like a hotel clerk, eager for a 5-star review. In those early weeks, Sharon tried, at least on the surface. She complimented my cooking, brought me tea, told me she admired how independent I was at my age. Funny how independence is praised right up until it becomes inconvenient for the people around you. After a month, they asked if their children could take over the office, just until we sort out arrangements. I agreed, of course. What grandmother wouldn't? I boxed up my papers, my sewing kit, my late husband's notebooks. I stacked them neatly in the attic, promising myself I'd reorganize everything later. Later never came. The den went next. We need a play area, Michael insisted, though the children mostly used it as a place to scatter toys like breadcrumbs through my house. Soon the living room followed. Sharon said the furniture was old-fashioned, and before I'd even formed a reply, 2 strangers from a moving service hauled out my coffee table, then my bookshelf, then the armchair where I'd spent mornings drinking tea for nearly 40 years. I watched my home shrink one room at a time, and each time I told myself it was temporary. A mother's mercy is sometimes indistinguishable from denial. It wasn't just space they took, it was air. They stopped asking before rearranging things, stopped knocking before entering my room, stopped pretending they lived with me and not over me. I found my kitchen reorganized 3 separate times. The mugs I liked were placed on a high shelf I couldn't reach. The spices I used were pushed to the back. Sharon once patted my hand and said, "It's better if everything has a logical system." Logical for whom? Dinner became the moment when I understood just how quiet a voice can become in a house that no longer belongs to you. They talked around me, over me, through me, as if I'd become a ghost who occasionally passed through solid walls but never left a mark. If I offered a suggestion, it was dismissed. If I mentioned something about the past, Sharon rolled her eyes in that subtle way young people think the elderly don't notice. But we notice. We always notice. I told myself I should speak up, but every time I opened my mouth, I saw Michael's jaw tighten, and I swallowed the words like bitter pills. That's the trouble with raising children to be ungrateful. You never realize you're doing it until it's too late. The day they took the laundry room for storage and suggested I temporarily sleep in the corner of the den, I nearly protested. But then Michael said something that stuck inside me like a thorn. "Mom, you're making this more complicated than it needs to be." As if I were the burden. As if their comfort justified my disappearance. I complied like I always did. I smiled. I nodded. I retreated. But every small surrender was a thread pulled loose, and eventually, the seam of a life begins to gape. By the time they gave my bed to their dog, that seam had split wide open, and though they didn't know it yet, the woman they thought they could fold into a corner had already begun stitching her spine back together, quietly, steadily, in the only place no one had taken from her. Inside. Silence can be a weapon, but in my house, it became a habit. A learned response, the way a person stops touching a hot stove after being burned enough times. I didn't choose to fade into quiet. I simply adjusted to the temperature of the people around me. At dinner, Michael would talk about his work as if delivering a speech to an audience who'd paid for tickets. Sharon would nod at all the right places, correcting him gently whenever he misquoted someone or exaggerated a detail. Their children would interrupt with stories from school, funny, loud, careless, and somewhere in the middle of all that noise sat an old woman who had once raised a family in this house, her voice growing smaller with every passing meal. Sometimes I tried to participate. I'd say, "That reminds me of when your father," but Michael would cut in, "Mom, can we stay on topic?" As if stories of their own childhood were irrelevant, clutter in the conversation. Or I'd ask the children about their classes. They'd answer without looking up from their screens, thumbs tapping out silent rhythms that had nothing to do with me. Sharon would sigh, almost pitying, as though I were too old-fashioned to understand the world they lived in. When did my presence become background noise? I can't pinpoint the moment. I suspect it was never a single moment at all, just a steady erosion. They used to ask for my opinion, on recipes, on curtains, on whether a certain shirt made Michael look too pale. But now, choices were made without me. I'd come into the kitchen and find new brands of food I'd never bought. I'd walk into the living room and see furniture angled differently. I'd open my closet and realize Sharon had reorganized for my convenience again. Convenience. Another leash word. It wasn't that they hated me. No. Indifference is much quieter than hatred. It settles over you like dust, coating your skin until you begin to disappear even from yourself. They still said thank you when I handed them something. They still hugged me on their way out the door, quick, polite, distracted. They still remembered my birthday, though last year I received a digital gift card sent at 11:58 p.m. Kind gestures, all of them. Just not the kind that make a person feel seen. I didn't cry. I'm past the age where tears offer relief. Instead, I folded myself into smaller and smaller spaces inside the home I once filled with my voice, my music, my stubborn opinions. I learned the art of stepping aside, physically, emotionally, spiritually. When a person steps aside long enough, she forgets how to take her place again. The only creature who seemed to notice me was Daisy. She'd trot over and rest her chin on my knee, eyes soft, tail slow as a metronome. When Michael scolded her for it, "Leave Grandma alone, she needs to rest," I had to look away. The irony might have choked me otherwise, but ghosts don't need rest. They drift, they hover, they wait. It might sound dramatic to say I became a ghost in my own home, but that's exactly what happened. I learned to move silently so I wouldn't interrupt. I learned to eat alone so my pace wouldn't slow them down. I learned to answer questions briefly so they wouldn't sigh and glance at each other over my head. Yet even ghosts can feel anger. Mine settled in bones that already ached enough without the weight of resentment. Bitterness is a dangerous companion for a woman my age. But clarity, now that is a gift. One evening, as I sat in the laundry room folding towels, another job no one noticed, I realized something quietly terrifying. They had made a world in which my comfort no longer mattered, and I had helped them build it. I thought of the Eleanor I used to be, sharp, capable, unafraid of speaking her truth. The woman who worked 2 jobs when Michael was young. The one who handled bills, repaired broken window frames, and taught her son how to drive. That Eleanor would have laughed at the version of me sitting in a laundry room with a cot for a bed. And for the first time, instead of sorrow, I felt shame. Not because of what they'd done, but because of how willingly I'd shrunk. A mother's love can swallow her whole if she lets it, and I had let it, over and over again. But shame has an unexpected virtue. It wakes you up. I stood, draped the towel over the rack, and looked at the small square window above the dryer. Outside, dusk was settling gently on the neighborhood. Inside, a decision began to rise like the moon, slow but unstoppable. Their voices carried faintly down the hall, laughing about something I likely wouldn't have understood. Yet for the first time in a long while, the sound didn't sting, because something in me had finally started to move again. And the woman they thought they'd tucked into silence was beginning to remember the shape of her own voice. Daisy was never the problem. Funny how people often mistake symbols for causes, when the truth hides in the hands that place those symbols where they do not belong. I didn't resent the dog. How could I? She had been mine long before she became theirs. George bought her for me on my 70th birthday, claiming every woman deserved at least one silly creature who adored her unconditionally. Daisy would curl up beside us on the couch, pressing her warm back against my leg, while George told stories about the years before Michael was born. After my husband died, she stayed close to me, sensing the empty space he left in the bed, in the kitchen chair, in the rhythm of breathing at night. But gradually, like everything in this house, she was taken too. It began innocently enough. Sharon insisted Daisy needed proper socialization, so she enrolled herself as the dog's unofficial second owner. Walks were now Sharon's responsibility until they weren't. The children fed Daisy treats under the table, not realizing they were bribing loyalty. Michael complained the dog hair was triggering his allergies, but only when Daisy sat with me. Somewhere along the way, Daisy stopped sleeping in my room. I'd wake to quiet hallways, only to see her curled in the den beside the kids' blankets. The first time it happened, I told myself she simply followed noise and youth. Two things an old woman can no longer offer. The second time, I accepted it. The third, I swallowed the ache because there wasn't room left in this house for anyone's emotions but theirs. But Daisy always found her way back to me when no one was looking. That was what kept me from feeling entirely erased. One afternoon, when the winter sun sat low and pale behind the backyard fence, I sat on the porch steps to rest my knees. I heard the sliding door open behind me, and then Daisy's soft trot. She nudged her head under my arm, the same way she used to when George sat beside me shelling peas. I stroked her ear slowly, grateful for a moment untouched by the noise inside the house. Then Michael's voice cut through the quiet. "Daisy, leave Mom alone. She doesn't need the fuss." He said it like a command, not out of concern, as if my presence were a chore for the dog, not the other way around. Daisy hesitated, then reluctantly moved toward him, tail low. I didn't say a word. I had learned not to. But inside me, something tiny cracked. Later that evening, they blamed Daisy's restlessness on my bad habits, as if affection were contagious in the wrong way. Sharon said, "You spoil her, Eleanor. She needs structure." As though structure couldn't coexist with love. As though a 78-year-old woman could corrupt a creature by simply being gentle. Still, I let it pass. I let so many things pass. But the day they brought in that enormous dog bed, blue, plush, the kind that costs more than my monthly groceries, I felt the shift. Sharon unboxed it like a gift to herself. Michael declared it would go in my room because it's the only place with enough space. And before I even understood the full implication, they were carrying my mattress out the door as if it were an old doormat. The worst part wasn't the removal. It was the conversation that followed. "Mom, Daisy deserves comfort in her old age," Michael said. Her old age. As though mine were somehow less deserving. As though I were the one who should adapt, give up, step aside. I remember looking at Daisy then. She sat at the foot of the bed, my bed, confused, ears lowered. She didn't understand why I wasn't smiling, why her presence didn't bring the happiness it once did. She wasn't the thief. She was the proof. Proof that they no longer distinguished between what was mine and what was convenient for them. Proof that love, when filtered through entitlement, becomes something sharp and thoughtless. Proof that kindness, when taken for granted, turns into a currency people feel entitled to spend. That night, as Daisy came scratching at the laundry room door to find me, I understood something quietly devastating. Even the dog knew where I belonged. My own family did not. I opened the door, knelt with difficulty, and pressed my forehead against her warm fur. "It's all right, girl," I whispered. "You didn't do this." And she rested beside me on the floor, refusing to return to the bed they'd claimed for her. Perhaps she sensed that tonight, for the first time, I was deciding not to surrender anymore. I didn't sleep. Not because of the cot, not because of the cold, but because a thought, steady and unyielding, had finally taken root inside me. If they could give my bed to their dog, then I could take my house back for myself. Money has a way of blurring boundaries, especially when the hands that give it are aging and the hands that receive it are young, hurried, and always just a little short on something. I used to believe generosity was a virtue you passed down, like a family recipe. But somewhere between the first check I wrote and the last one they quietly expected, generosity became obligation, and obligation became silence. It began long before they moved in. Michael called one evening, voice tight, apologetic in that practiced way he uses when he needs something. "Mom, we're in a bit of a bind. Just for this month. We'll pay you back." The phrase, "we'll pay you back," was the garnish he sprinkled on every request, though no repayment ever arrived, and eventually, the garnish stopped being offered at all. I didn't mind at first. A mother helps her son. It's what we do. But help, when repeated without gratitude, begins to feel like tribute. There were the missed rent payments on their apartment. Then the surprise medical bill for one of the children. Then a car repair. Then another car repair. Then the emergency that turned out to be a weekend vacation they'd booked months earlier and forgot to cancel. When I gently asked why they didn't tell me the truth, Sharon laughed and said, "Oh, Eleanor, you worry too much. It was just a small getaway." Small, yes, but not for me. Still, I opened my checkbook each time. Because that's what mothers do. Because that's what widows do when their only son still needs them. Because I wanted to believe I mattered to them beyond the money. When they moved into my home, the requests didn't stop, only shifted shape. Now it was groceries. We're feeding 4, Eleanor, you understand. Gas money. Michael's job is far away. School fees. New clothes for the children. Cleaning supplies for messes I didn't make. Sharon added things to my grocery list without asking. Almond milk, protein powders, imported biscuits, snacks that cost more than my weekly utilities. When I raised an eyebrow, she smiled sweetly and said, "You don't want the kids to feel deprived, do you?" Deprived. An interesting word to use in a house where I slept beside a dryer. The subtlety was what hurt most. They never shoved a bill into my hand, not outright. They left them on the kitchen counter, under my teacup, near my reading glasses, as if the bills themselves had chosen me out of affection. I'd find an envelope marked urgent, tucked beneath the sugar bowl, a school fee notice placed directly atop my newspaper, a car insurance renewal left on my pillow like an unwelcome love letter. At first, I thought these were coincidences. Then I realized coincidences rarely stack themselves with such precision. One afternoon, Michael approached me in the kitchen, rubbing the back of his neck. "Mom, about the credit card payment, it bounced. We just need a little help this week. Things are tight." Things were always tight, except for the days they weren't. Like the day a package arrived, an expensive smart speaker for the kids, or the time Sharon came home with new shoes that cost more than my entire wardrobe, or when they ordered takeout from upscale restaurants while I ate leftovers, because it's better for your digestion, Eleanor. I didn't say a word, not out loud. But inside, a quiet arithmetic formed, a tally, not of dollars, but of disregard. What struck me hardest was not the money itself. Money comes and goes. I'd lived long enough to know that. It was the way they treated what I gave, carelessly, thoughtlessly, as if my wallet were a river that would never run dry. They forgot that rivers have sources, and sources can choose when to stop flowing. The shame wasn't theirs, it was mine. I enabled every bit of it. Each check I signed was a stitch closing my own mouth. Each payment I made was a step deeper into invisibility. The Eleanor I used to be, the one who insisted every dollar be accounted for, had vanished somewhere in the fog of grief after George died. Loneliness makes a person soften where she should stay firm. It makes her say yes when she should say no. It makes her believe that giving is the same as being loved. I see now how wrong that was. By the time they took my bed, I had already given them far more than money. I had given them the belief that I didn't matter. But money has one unexpected virtue. It leaves a paper trail. And paper, unlike people, can be very obedient. That week, as I gathered receipts and statements, I began to see the shape of something forming, something sharp, something resolute. If they had used my kindness for convenience, then I would use my signature for liberation. Cruelty doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers in small corrections, in tightened smiles, in the way someone's eyes slide past you as if you're in the way of their life. The world imagines cruelty as loud, but in a family, it's subtle. It's the soft-footed kind that creeps into your bones, convincing you that you deserve less space, less voice, less air. It was the little things that cut the deepest. Like the morning Sharon stood in the kitchen doorway, watching me spread butter on toast. "Eleanor," she said with a voice dipped in false concern, "that's far too much fat for someone your age. Let me make something healthier." She took the toast from my hands, my breakfast, and threw it in the trash as if discarding a bad habit. Or the afternoon I reached for my coat to walk Daisy, only for Michael to gently press my arm down. "Mom, you walk too slowly. It frustrates the dog. I'll take her." As if my pace had somehow become an inconvenience to a creature who once matched me step for step. Even the children learned the script. "Grandma, you take forever," they'd complain when I tried to tie my shoes or peel an orange. No malice in their voices, just the casual cruelty of youth that had been modeled for them. Meals became another stage for these small humiliations. If I used too much salt, Sharon frowned. If I didn't finish my portion, Michael said, "Mom, you need to eat more, or you'll get weaker." If I asked for help opening a jar, Sharon would sigh just loudly enough for it to count as commentary. "Let me," she'd say, as though doing me a favor was a burden she bore heroically. I remember one evening in particular. I'd spent the afternoon preparing a stew the way George liked, slow, patient, with vegetables cut to the size he always insisted, cooked just right. When I set it on the table, proud of the aroma filling the kitchen, Sharon took a single spoonful, wrinkled her nose, and said, "It's a bit bland, isn't it? Maybe next time follow a recipe." Next time. As though my decades of feeding a family counted for nothing. As though I were a novice in my own kitchen. They didn't mean to be cruel. That's what made it worse. Thoughtless harm leaves no room for apologies, only explanations. But the moment that stayed with me was quieter still. One evening, I entered the living room holding a blanket folded neatly in my arms. The room was filled with their voices, the glow of the television, the warm clutter of a family settling in. I hesitated in the doorway, wondering where I should sit. Before I could choose, Sharon's hand swept the air in that dismissive little gesture of hers. "Eleanor, could you watch Daisy in the laundry room? She keeps pacing around you." She said it lightly, as though asking me to fetch sugar from the pantry, but the message was clear: you don't belong here. I walked back down the hall in silence, listening as their laughter resumed the moment my footsteps faded. Daisy followed me, pressing her head gently against my knee as though offering an apology she didn't owe. That night, I lay on the cot, the hum of the dryer filling the small room, and I realized cruelty didn't require raised voices. It required only a steady erosion of dignity, one small cut after another. A mispronounced name, a corrected sentence, a dismissed thought, a closed door. A lifetime ago, I would have confronted them. George used to call me the woman with the iron spine because I never let anyone tell me what I could or couldn't do. But grief softens bones. Loneliness weakens resolve. And time wears down even iron. Yet something in me had begun to resist again. A faint pulse beneath years of silence. Not anger, not yet. Just a quiet refusal to keep shrinking. As I listened to Daisy breathing beside me, I smoothed the blanket over my legs and thought, if they can't hear my voice, then they will eventually hear my absence. Or better yet, they will feel the consequences of it. The cuts they made were small, but small cuts, left unattended, can bleed a person back into strength. A house doesn't stop being yours the moment someone else fills its rooms, but it can start feeling foreign long before that. As the months went on, I noticed how naturally Michael and Sharon treated my home as though it were simply an extension of their own needs. At first, it was subtle, an extra vase here, a stack of their magazines there. Then it grew bolder. My framed photographs were replaced with theirs. My kitchen towels disappeared, replaced by brightly patterned ones Sharon insisted were more modern. Even the scent of the house changed. Gone was the gentle lavender oil I'd used for years, replaced by a harsh citrus spray Sharon preferred. One morning, I came into the living room and found Sharon pushing my old wooden coffee table, George's table, toward the door. "What are you doing?" I asked. She didn't look up. "Donating it. We found a nicer one online. The delivery's coming today." I stood there, stunned. "Sharon, that table was George's." She paused, hands resting on the wood. For a moment, I thought she might reconsider. But then her expression softened into that patronizing smile she always saved for me. "Eleanor, you have to let go of the past. It's just furniture." For her, it was. For me, it was the place where George used to set down his morning coffee while reading the paper, tapping his finger when he disagreed with the headlines. It was where Michael built his first model airplane. It was where I folded hundreds of freshly washed shirts when the children were small. But Sharon didn't see any of that, and she didn't need my permission to erase it. That afternoon, without consulting me, Michael moved the television to a different wall. The bookshelf was shifted. The curtains were swapped out for ones that brightened the space. The den, once a quiet place where I embroidered in the evenings, became a gaming area, cluttered with wires and bright plastic toys. Every choice was made as though I were a tenant, not the homeowner. Once I tried speaking up. "Michael," I said softly as he rearranged the dining room chairs, "I'd prefer the room to stay how it was." He didn't even turn fully toward me. "Mom, the old layout didn't make sense. Trust us. We know what we're doing." Us. As if I weren't part of that equation. The final straw happened on a gray morning, the kind where the air feels heavy with things unspoken. I went into the shed to retrieve a box of fall decorations, small ceramic pumpkins George bought me one autumn after I admired them at a craft fair. But when I opened the shed, the shelves were bare. Boxes gone, decorations gone, even my gardening tools gone. I ran my hand along the empty shelf, dustless from recent movement. When I asked Michael about it later, he barely looked up from his laptop. "Oh, those? They were taking up space. Most of it was old stuff. We tossed it." Old stuff. 40 years of memories, reduced to clutter. I felt something cold and metallic settle in my chest. Not anger, not yet. More like the tightening of a screw inside my spine, turning slowly but decisively. That evening, when they all went out for ice cream, I stayed behind. I walked through each room, touching objects that were still mine, measuring which parts of the house remained loyal to me. The framed photo of George and me on the mantel was tilted, as if the house itself had grown weary of standing straight under the weight of unwelcome change. I fixed it gently. Then, almost without thinking, I went to the hall closet where George had kept an old metal lockbox. I hadn't opened it since the year after he died. My hands shook slightly as I knelt and pulled it out, brushing off the thin layer of dust. Inside were envelopes, paperwork, notes in George's familiar handwriting, the deed to the house, insurance documents, banking details, things he once reviewed at the dining table, carefully explaining every line so I wouldn't be left in the dark if anything ever happened to him. I ran my fingers along the edge of the deed, my name printed clearly, firmly, unquestionably. For the first time in months, I felt steady. This house was not slipping away from me. I had simply stepped back long enough for others to imagine it wasn't mine. But a woman who knows what she owns is hard to dispossess. I placed the papers back into the lockbox, closed it with a soft click, and held the key in my palm. The metal felt warm from my skin, warm like a promise. I wasn't ready to act yet, but I was preparing, quietly, purposefully, like a storm gathering behind a still sky. They could rearrange my furniture. They could toss my belongings. They could claim my space with careless hands. But the house was mine, and soon they would remember exactly what that meant. People assume old age makes a woman helpless, but in truth, it only makes her quiet. And quiet is often mistaken for weakness by the very people who should know better. The morning I decided to seek legal advice was cool and pale, the kind that carries a faint smell of rain. Michael had left a pile of unopened bills on the counter again, ones with my name listed as guarantor, though I had never agreed to such a thing. Sharon was already complaining about the cost of groceries, hinting I should reevaluate my budget if I wanted to keep contributing. Their voices blended into a background hum, like an argument happening in another room. But I wasn't listening anymore. I was reading the deed, my name, my signature, my house. I didn't pack much, just the lockbox, my glasses, and a sweater. George once said made me look capable of anything. I waited for them to leave, then called a taxi. The driver helped me in gently, unaware that the old woman settling into the back seat was carrying the beginnings of a quiet revolution. The law office sat in a modest building near the harbor. Nothing grand, nothing intimidating. Just a brass plaque and a door that creaked when opened. The attorney, Ms. Rowan, was a woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes softened by kindness. She stood when I entered. "Mrs. Hayes, please come in. What can I help you with today?" I placed the lockbox on her desk. "My family moved into my home," I said calmly. "They have overstayed. They have crossed boundaries." She nodded slowly, as though she already knew the type of story she was about to hear. "And what would you like to do?" That question, simple, gentle, struck me harder than any cruelty I had endured. What would I like? No one had asked me that in years. Not about dinner, not about holidays, not about my own home. "I want my house back," I said. Her eyes softened, but her posture straightened. "Then let's begin." She reviewed my documents meticulously, line by line, occasionally adjusting her glasses or making notes. The deed confirmed what I already knew. The house was solely mine. No co-owners, no liens, no legal obstacles. "You have every right," she said, "to remove anyone living in your home without permission, family or not." The word family landed heavily. Not painful, just factual. She explained the process. Formal written notices, legal timeframes, signatures filed with the county. Everything above board, clean, impossible to contest. The law may not always be compassionate, but it is wonderfully clear. I listened, steady as a stone, while she prepared the first set of documents. She slid them toward me, her pen waiting. "These will begin the process. When you're ready, you'll sign here." My hand hovered over the page, not trembling, just pausing long enough to acknowledge the weight of the moment. The end of an old life. The beginning of a new one. For years, I had allowed their needs to override my rights, their voices to drown out my own. But here, in this quiet office, my voice returned to me. I signed. The pen glided smoothly, without hesitation. It felt like reclaiming breath. When I left the office, the sky had brightened. A breeze came off the harbor carrying the scent of salt and something else. Something like possibility. I stood there for a moment, letting the wind brush across my face, and felt taller than I had in years. I was no longer waiting for them to treat me better. I was preparing for the day they would face the consequences of treating me poorly. The world often forgets that an old woman with a backbone is a force to be reckoned with. And by the time I got home, I knew exactly what I needed to do next. The drive home felt different that day. Not shorter, not longer, simply clearer, as if the world had sharpened its edges while I was in that law office. I sat in the back seat of the taxi with the lockbox on my lap, holding it the way other women might hold a fragile vase. But nothing about what was inside felt fragile to me anymore. Power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hums quietly beneath your ribs, steady as breath. The taxi rolled past familiar streets, the bakery George used to favor for its honest bread, the old church where Michael was baptized, the row of maple trees that turned into yellow torches every autumn. I had lived in this town my entire life, raised a family, buried a husband, built routines like scaffolding around my days. Yet I realized, with painful clarity, that I had let others dismantle those routines piece by piece. Not anymore. Not after today. The driver glanced at me in the mirror. "You okay back there, ma'am?" "I'm fine," I said. And for the first time in a long while, it was true. As we approached my neighborhood, the houses seemed smaller than I remembered, as if they were bowing, not out of submission, but out of recognition. I wasn't returning home as the woman who left. I was returning as someone who had finally remembered she owned the ground she walked on. When the taxi pulled into my driveway, I sat still for a moment. The house looked the same: white porch rails, faded shutters, the small garden I once tended with pride. But I saw it differently now. The siding needed repainting. The steps needed repair. A wind chime Sharon hung last month clattered too loudly in the breeze. Little things, but they called to me with new meaning. They were mine. All of it was mine. I thanked the driver, gathered my lockbox, and stepped onto the walkway. Each footfall felt like reclaiming territory. The porch creaked under my weight in that familiar way, as though greeting me. Inside, the house carried its usual chorus: the distant laughter of the children, Sharon talking on the phone, Michael pacing with some annoyance brewing. None of them noticed me at first. They rarely did. I moved through the entryway without speaking, the lockbox firm against my hip. As I passed the living room, Sharon's laughter burst out, bright, sharp, unrestrained. Something about it grated against the quiet I'd collected all day. Michael was complaining about finances again. I could tell by his clipped tone. Words like deadline and late fee floated through the air. I paused, but didn't step in. Their noise didn't belong to me anymore. In my bedroom, my stolen bedroom, I saw Daisy curled up on the dog bed they had bought for her. Not on the mattress, not on the pillows, on the new bed. Quiet, as though sensing the shift in energy around her. Her eyes lifted to mine, soft and searching. "It's all right, girl," I whispered. And it was. I took the lockbox to the laundry room, my imposed quarters, and set it gently on the cot. Then I sat beside it and breathed, slow and deliberate. The paperwork Ms. Rowan had prepared was folded neatly inside. Official notices, timeframes. A script the law would follow without emotion or hesitation. A curious peace filled me as I opened the box and looked at the documents again. Not triumph. Something steadier. Something like alignment. As though the world had stopped tilting beneath my feet. I did not rush. Power doesn't need haste. I simply reviewed each page, tracing the edges with my fingertip, acknowledging the weight they carried. When I finished, I closed the lockbox and placed my hand on top of it. This wasn't anger. It wasn't revenge. It was restoration. Outside the laundry room, the house hummed with life that wasn't mine. Doors opening and closing, voices rising and fading, plans being made without me. But soon, very soon, those sounds would change. For now, I sat quietly, letting the calm spread through me like warm water. A storm was coming, and for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of it. The last straw didn't arrive with shouting or slamming doors. It came quietly, like all the others, so quietly that for a moment I wondered if I was imagining the cruelty of it. But no. Some humiliations are unmistakable, even when delivered in soft voices. It was a Thursday evening, the kind where the sky turns lavender before slipping into darkness. I was folding towels in the laundry room, the room they insisted was more appropriate for me, when I heard Michael and Sharon whispering down the hall. Their whispers weren't meant for secrecy. They were meant to exclude. There's a difference you learn to recognize when you've spent enough time as the afterthought in your own home. I can't take this negativity anymore, Sharon said, her voice tense. Your mother keeps making faces when I change things. It ruins the whole atmosphere of the house. The house, not her house. The house. Michael sighed. She's set in her ways. You know how old people get. She'll adjust. Adjust. Another leash word. I kept folding. One corner, then another. Anyway, Sharon continued, we've decided Daisy shouldn't go into the laundry room anymore. It smells like detergent, and she gets restless. I want her to sleep somewhere comfortable, somewhere peaceful. A pause. Then Michael's voice, softer. She should just stay in our room? Or maybe Mom's old room? My hands froze mid-fold. Sharon laughed lightly. Oh, please. Eleanor doesn't need a whole bedroom. She barely uses any space. The laundry room is fine for her. Michael's silence was agreement. I felt something click inside me. Not a snap, not a break. Something mechanical, functional. A gear sliding into place. Later that night, when the house settled into its evening rhythm, I walked toward the kitchen to make tea. As I rounded the corner, I found them standing in my old bedroom, their bedroom now, adjusting the position of the dog bed. Daisy was already curled in the center of the mattress I had slept on for 38 years. I didn't speak. Neither did they. Sharon looked at me with a smile so polished, it reflected every ounce of condescension she felt. We moved Daisy's things here. She sleeps better on a real bed. A real bed. My bed. I looked at Daisy, who lifted her head, tail thumping slowly, unsure why the air had become so tense. The poor creature didn't understand the drama unfolding around her. She wasn't the villain. She was the pawn. I murmured her name, and she hopped down to nuzzle my hand. Sharon clucked her tongue. Daisy. No. Stay. Grandma needs to rest. Rest. In the laundry room, next to the dryer, on a cot that folded in half when you moved wrong. I stepped backward until the hallway met the soles of my shoes. Michael rubbed his forehead with weary irritation. Mom, please don't make this harder. We're doing the best we can. The best they can. I nodded once, slowly, as though absorbing his words. But I wasn't absorbing. I was concluding. Their best had become an erasure of my life. Their convenience had become my displacement. Their entitlement had become my silence. Not anymore. I went to the kitchen, boiled water, and sat at the table with my tea. Steam curled toward my face, warm and steady. I watched it until it disappeared. The house hummed with familiar noises, TV chatter, children's footsteps, the refrigerator cycling on. But tonight, the sounds seemed far away, like echoes from a home I once visited, but no longer lived in. I sipped my tea, savoring its heat. The decision wasn't dramatic. It didn't crash into me. It arrived calmly, like a woman knocking gently at her own door after years of being locked outside. Tomorrow, I would deliver the notices, not in anger, not in retaliation, but in restoration. I placed my empty cup in the sink, dried my hands on a towel, and walked slowly back to the laundry room. Daisy followed me halfway, then stopped, confused, torn between instinct and training. Go on, girl, I whispered. She whimpered, but turned back. I closed the door behind me. In the quiet darkness, I imagined the look on their faces when they opened those envelopes. Not gloating, just clarity. The kind clarity only a signature can deliver. A storm was coming, and for once, I would not be the one weathering it. The night before, a storm rarely feels like danger. It feels like stillness, a heavy, waiting stillness that settles on the skin and tells you something is about to shift. Permanently, irreversibly. That night, my house felt like it was holding its breath. Michael and Sharon had gone to bed earlier than usual. The children were tucked away behind closed doors. Even Daisy wandered the hallway only briefly before curling up near their room, though she paused in front of the laundry door as if expecting me to open it. I didn't. Not tonight. Tonight, I needed the silence to myself. I sat on the cot, the blankets neatly folded, the lockbox beside me like a companion. I opened it slowly, carefully, as though the papers inside were living things. In a way, they were. They carried a pulse. Mine. The notices lay on top, crisp, formal, without apology. I traced the edge of each envelope, feeling the weight of the decisions sealed inside them. There was no anger in me, only a deep, steady resolve. Anger burns too quickly. Resolve is patient. It waits for dawn. Beside the notices was a photo of George I hadn't realized I'd kept in the box. He was smiling at the camera in that unguarded way he never shared with the world, only with me. Seeing him now, the years folded neatly into a single breath. "I'm doing what you would have done," I whispered into the quiet. Not revenge, protection of the life we built, of the dignity I still possessed, of the woman I refused to let disappear. I set the photo aside and began preparing the envelopes. I used my best handwriting, slow, deliberate, confident. My signature at the bottom of each page felt like reclaiming something that had been slipping through my fingers one small compromise at a time. The house creaked around me, adjusting to its own weight. For the first time, I wondered if the walls had been waiting too, waiting for someone to remember their value, waiting for their rightful owner to stand up straight again. As I worked, Daisy scratched at the door once, softly, a quiet question. When I didn't answer, she lay down with a miserable sigh. The poor dog didn't understand any of this, but she understood tension. She felt the air thickening, felt the shift inside my voice when I told her, "Not tonight, girl." When everything was finished, I placed the envelopes in a neat stack on the small table beside the dryer. Tomorrow morning, they would sit at the kitchen table and drink coffee that wasn't mine from cups I no longer recognized. And they would find these waiting for them. Eviction notices. Legal. Final. Signed by the woman they had mistaken for frail. I turned off the light and lay on the cot, though I knew sleep wouldn't come. The room was dark except for the faint glow under the door, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the soft murmur of wind brushing against the siding. In that darkness, I thought about the years I'd spent lowering my voice so theirs could rise, the meals I'd cooked that were deemed not quite right, the rooms of my home that had been taken, rearranged, dismissed as outdated, the space I occupied shrinking until I could fit inside a laundry room without anyone thinking it strange. But tomorrow the walls would shift again, not because they moved, but because I did. And I fell asleep, not with dread, but with a quiet certainty. The sun would rise. And so would I. Morning came without hesitation, as mornings often do, even when the people inside a house are not ready for what it carries. I woke before anyone else. Not from discomfort, though the cot was predictably unforgiving, but from purpose. Purpose is a better alarm clock than any ringing device. The house lay in that soft gray quiet before the day takes shape. I sat for a moment on the edge of the cot, smoothing my sweater, feeling the weight of the notices inside my cardigan pocket. My heart wasn't racing. In fact, it felt remarkably still, like a pond untouched by wind. When I opened the door, Daisy stood there waiting, tail wagging tentatively. She sensed something unusual. Animals always do. I scratched behind her ear, and she leaned into my hand, offering the kind of comfort no human in this house had offered in years. "Come on, girl," I whispered. She followed. In the kitchen, the early light washed across the countertops, catching dust motes in its beam. The quiet felt almost sacred. As I set the envelopes in the center of the kitchen table, I placed each one carefully, as though they were fragile items, not because the papers themselves were delicate, but because the truth inside them was sharp enough to cut. One envelope for Michael, one for Sharon, one for each child's guardian, each addressed with dignity they had not shown me. I brewed a pot of tea, not because I intended to drink it, but because rituals matter. They steady the hands. They remind a woman she is still herself. By the time I heard footsteps upstairs, the kettle had cooled slightly, and the notices were waiting in perfect formation. Michael came down first, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He didn't see me at the table and assumed I was in the laundry room, as always. He reached for the envelopes absent-mindedly, thinking they were bills. The moment his eyes skimmed the heading, his expression froze, like a curtain pulled down mid-performance. "Mom?" His voice cracked in a way I hadn't heard since he was 12. I looked at him calmly. "Good morning?" Sharon appeared next, hair undone, irritation already blooming on her face. "What now?" "Why are we—" She stopped when she saw the papers in Michael's hands. "What is this?" she demanded. "An official notice," I said. "You have 30 days to vacate my home." Michael blinked at me as though trying to bring me into focus. "Mom, you can't be serious." "I am." He looked back at the paper, then at me. "We're family." "Yes," I said gently, "which is why I let things go on far longer than I should have." Sharon scoffed. "This is ridiculous. We've built our lives here. We've invested in this house." "No," I corrected. "You've inhabited it. There is a difference." Her face twisted. "Where are we supposed to go?" "The same places you told your friends you'd find when you were ready to move out. I believe those were your words last month." Michael stepped toward me, palms out, as if approaching a frightened animal. "Mom, let's just talk about this." "Michael," I said softly, "I've tried talking. For months. Years. You did not hear me when I was quiet. So now you will hear the paper." He opened his mouth, closed it again, then sat heavily in a chair, elbows on the table. The children wandered in, still sleepy, sensing tension, but not understanding it. Sharon snapped at them to go upstairs. Her voice held more edge than it ever had with me. As the kids left, she rounded on me. "How dare you do this to us?" "How dare you treat my home as yours?" I replied, "and treat me as inconvenient." Silence. The kind that expands, filling every corner of a room. Michael finally spoke, his voice low. "We didn't mean to hurt you, Mom." "I know," I said. "That is what made it possible. Carelessness always feels gentler than cruelty, until you are the one being crushed by it." He lowered his eyes. "You have 30 days, I repeated. "The notices are legal. Everything is in order." Sharon opened her mouth to argue again, but something in my expression stopped her. Perhaps for the first time, she saw not frailty, not softness. but a boundary. A real one. I stood, steady on my feet. For years, I gave you space, I said quietly. Now, I am taking mine back. Daisy brushed against my leg, as if signaling the moment was complete. And with that, I walked out of the kitchen, leaving the storm behind me and stepping into my own calm. I didn't stay to watch their reactions, not out of fear, out of peace. Peace is a strange thing. Sometimes it arrives after you set the world on fire. Mine came the moment I stepped out of the kitchen and left them to face the truth that had been waiting for far too long. I walked onto the porch and sat down slowly, feeling the air touch my face with a gentleness I had forgotten existed. The morning was cool, the sun barely pushing through the clouds. For the first time in years, I felt the house behind me, not as something pressing down on me, but as something standing with me. Inside, the storm broke. It began with Sharon's voice, sharp enough to slice through the walls. "She can't do this! She can't!" Then Michael's, strained and uneven. "Sharon, stop shouting. We need to think. The notice is legal. It's all legal." Drawers opened. Something slammed. A chair scraped loudly against the floor. The children, still too groggy to understand why their mother was crying, began to cry too. I listened, not with satisfaction, but with distance. Their panic was theirs, not mine, not anymore. Daisy nudged open the porch door with her nose and came to sit beside me, laying her warm head on my knee. I stroked her gently. She didn't know laws or boundaries or consequences. She only knew the difference between chaos and calm. And today, she chose calm. "Good girl," I whispered. "It's all right." From inside the house, the chaos rose and fell in waves. Sharon's voice, angry, disbelieving, wounded by her own entitlement. Michael's voice, guilt-struck, defensive, overwhelmed. The children, whimpers and confusion. Footsteps pacing, cabinets closing, papers rustling. It sounded like a family unraveling. But the truth was simpler. They were rearranging themselves around a reality they had never expected. For years, they relied on my softness. Now they had to face my boundaries. I sat there listening, letting their noise pass over me the way wind moves through dry leaves. The porch boards under my feet felt steady, rooted. The railing, worn and splintered from age, held firm beneath my hand. This house had seen joy, grief, storms, summers, and now, consequences. A door slammed. Michael stepped outside, red-faced, shoulders heaving as if he'd run a mile. "Mom," he said, breathless, "please, let's talk." I looked at him. Really looked. Not at the man he'd become, but at the boy he once was. The boy who scraped his knees climbing this very porch railing. The boy who once cried in my arms when he broke his model airplane. The boy who, somewhere along the way, forgot the woman who raised him. "There's nothing to discuss, Michael." He flinched, not from harshness, but from truth. "You blindsided us," he said quietly. "No," I replied. "I endured you, and now I am done enduring." He lowered himself onto the steps, elbows on his knees, staring at the street. His voice, when it came, was small. We never meant to hurt you." "I know," I said. "Carelessness rarely recognizes itself." He pressed a hand over his face. "Where will we go?" "You're adults," I answered. "You will find a way. As you've told your friends many times, you were planning to move soon. Now you will." A long silence settled between us. Not tense, not angry, just honest. Inside, Sharon shouted something about calling her parents. The children cried again. Michael didn't move. I reached into my pocket and handed him a tissue. He took it without speaking. Finally, he stood. "We'll figure it out." "You will?" I said. He walked back inside, closing the door gently. Not out of respect, perhaps, but out of understanding that something had shifted permanently. I remained on the porch, watching the clouds drift lazily across the sky. The air tasted different, lighter, freer, familiar. Behind me, their voices collided and clashed like waves on rocks. But I did not turn. I did not intervene. I did not apologize. Their storm had arrived, and I was no longer standing in the center of it. I was simply watching it pass. They left in pieces, not all at once, not in a single dramatic exit, but gradually, like a tide that had finally learned it could not climb any higher against a solid shore. The first week brought only frantic packing and tense silences. The second brought slammed drawers, hurried phone calls, and the sound of boxes thudding against floors. By the third week, the house began to empty itself of their presence. And with each thing they carried out, the rooms seemed to exhale. Sharon was the first to crumble. She rushed from task to task, muttering under her breath about timing and injustice, unable to comprehend a world in which she did not dictate the order of things. She scrubbed the kitchen counters furiously, as if trying to erase any trace of the decision that had undone her sense of ownership. One afternoon, I found her standing in my old bedroom beside the dog bed that had once replaced my mattress. She wasn't touching anything, just staring. "You're really making us move," she said without turning. "I'm allowing you to live your own life," I replied. "Outside mine." She made a small, wounded sound, somewhere between disbelief and offense. But she didn't argue. She picked up a box and carried it out. Michael was quieter, more methodical. Each day he moved through the house like a man paying respects at a grave, touching door frames, checking closets, closing cabinets too gently. He had aged in the span of a week, the lines on his face deeper, the slump of his shoulders more pronounced. One evening, he approached me on the porch, the very place where he once asked for ice cream money as a boy. "Mom," he said, voice rough. I didn't realize how far things had gone. "No," I answered softly. "You didn't look." He nodded, slowly, painfully, and I saw something shift behind his eyes. Not regret, not yet, but the first tiny spark of recognition. Children do not always see the harm they inflict until they are forced to confront the ruins. Inside the house, the children reacted differently. They didn't understand the legalities. They only knew they were leaving familiar rooms. The older one cried while packing her posters. The younger one asked if Daisy could still visit me. I told him yes. It was the only answer that didn't fracture something inside me. But the house, my house, responded to their departure with unmistakable relief. When Sharon's wall art came down, the paint seemed less strained. When Michael unplugged the gaming console, the room felt quieter in a way that wasn't empty, just honest. When the last of their suitcases disappeared through the front door, the hallway widened as if remembering its true shape. And then, on the final day, came the moment I had been waiting for. Michael approached me with the house key, my spare, held between his fingers. He didn't offer it at first, just looked at it, turning himself. "I never meant to push you out," he said. "I know," I replied, "but intention doesn't erase impact." He swallowed. His throat worked like a man forcing down a truth he should have tasted long ago. Then he placed the key in my palm with slow, deliberate care. The metal felt warm from his hand, but it cooled almost instantly against my skin. "Goodbye, Mom," he said quietly. "Goodbye, Michael." He turned away. The children followed him. Sharon walked last, chin lifted, eyes flashing with a wounded pride she had built like armor. She didn't speak to me, and I didn't expect her to. When the door closed behind them, the silence that settled was unlike any I'd heard in years. Not the silence of being ignored, not the silence of being forgotten, but the silence of sovereignty. I stood in the center of the living room, my living room, and let the stillness wrap itself around me. Dust floated lazily in the sunbeams cutting across the floorboards. The air carried no perfume but my own. The house no longer hummed with the tension of too many people. It simply breathed. I walked through it slowly, touching familiar surfaces, restoring them with my fingertips. The mantel, the window frame, the dining table. My pace was unhurried, deliberate. This was not reclaiming. This was remembering. When I reached my old bedroom, Daisy was waiting at the door, tail tapping against the wood in a slow rhythm. She had chosen to stay with me for the afternoon. Sharon hadn't argued. Perhaps even she understood loyalty when she saw it. I opened the door. My mattress was back in place. My linens were neatly folded. My photographs, those they hadn't discarded, sat on the dresser, angled toward the light. It wasn't finished. Not yet. But it was mine again. I stepped inside, and Daisy followed, curling at my feet. Her eyes lifted to mine with a soft question. "Yes," I whispered, smoothing the quilt. "We're home." And for the first time in a long, long time, the room answered back. The first night alone in my restored home felt almost unreal. Not because anything miraculous happened, no triumphant music, no dramatic transformation, just quiet. A simple, steady quiet that settled over the walls like a long-absent friend returning with an overnight bag. I walked through the house slowly, the way one revisits a place after years away, even though I had lived here all along. The floorboards creaked beneath my steps in familiar patterns. The scent of my lavender oil had begun to drift back into the air, and the kitchen light, which Sharon used to keep too bright, glowed with the soft warmth I remembered. Every room felt wider, not physically, but spiritually. There was space again, for breath, for memory, for me. That evening, I stood at the threshold of my bedroom. My real bedroom. The quilt I had sewn in the early years of my marriage lay neatly across the mattress, waiting. Daisy hopped up with surprising gentleness for a dog her age and settled near my feet, as she used to before everyone decided she needed structure. I sat on the edge of the bed and pressed my palm to the familiar fabric. It felt like touching a life I'd almost let slip from my hands. The house made small, contented noises, wood shifting, the heater humming lightly, the wind brushing against the eaves. For once, none of it sounded like disruption. It sounded like home exhaling after holding tension for too long. When I finally lay down, the mattress welcomed me with a softness I had long forgotten. My body eased into it, joints loosening, breath deepening. Daisy sighed and nudged her nose against my ankle, as if confirming that the world had righted itself. I stared at the ceiling, where George and I used to trace imaginary constellations on sleepless nights. For the first time since he died, I didn't feel the ache of absence. I felt his steadiness, his quiet insistence that dignity is not a thing to surrender, even out of love. The house was mine again, but more importantly, I was mine again. I didn't fall asleep quickly. Old women rarely do. Instead, I drifted in and out of gentle thoughts, not of anger, not of victory, just of truth. that reclaiming a life doesn't always require shouting, that consequences can be delivered calmly, that self-respect sometimes arrives wearing legal shoes and a steady hand. As the night deepened, the past months fell away one by one until only a soft clarity remained. I turned onto my side, pulled the quilt a little higher, and whispered into the dark, "I'm home, George." And the quiet answered, as if it had been waiting to hear those words. Before sleep took me, I thought of other women. Women who feel themselves shrinking in the houses they built. Women who give and give until their hands are empty. Women who mistake silence for kindness. And so, if you're listening to my story now, let me tell you gently, don't wait for someone to return your dignity. It is already yours. Take it back when the moment comes, quietly or boldly, but take it back. Your life still belongs to you, and it is never too late to come home to yourself.